The World Economic Forum, Stellenbosch University New Social Covenant event made possible by Barclays Africa.
At the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2013, the concept of a new social covenant was first documented. The discussion was taken further in September of 2013 at Georgetown University, and this is the third part of the journey. A social covenant is looking to redeem the broken social contract between government, between civil society and business. Let's take a look.
The World Economic Forum's New Social Covenant is a response to a world in crisis. Rising distrust worldwide is a direct result of the crisis in financial markets and lack of faith in the decisions of those in power.
The entire initiative around the covenant is premised on the idea that the social contract has been broken, that the trust that's necessary to bring us to economic success, to bring us to a cooperation in which equality is recognized, these are things that are currently broken.
Is essentially about partnerships between governments, the civil society and the private sector. I think because it's such a big conversation, as you rightly point out, we're faced with global concerns, a global crisis, I think one can call it, in terms of growing inequality, social unrest, concerns about the planet and the environment. And the reasoning behind these ideas about a social covenant or a social compact is that all role players would have to get together to form consensus on the road ahead. The problems are too big for any specific sector to solve on its own.
The New Social Covenant is based on three fundamental values. They unite human aspirations across race, gender, and religious affiliation.
First one, the dignity of the human person. We need governments, businesses to commit to the dignity of the person, whatever their race, their gender, and their background or belief. That's the first very big commitment that we need. A further one is the importance of the common good, that there is something like a common good, an acknowledgement of a common good that we all strive for, and that is perhaps somehow bigger than just the individual preferences and individual goals that we set for ourselves. And then a third one, the need for stewardship. That's about the future. We need to steward our natural resources. We need to look into how we use or abuse it. So in all of this, if we just go quicker and faster in using all of this up, then I think we're in real trouble. So the values are actually the very, very concrete things that makes our lives worth living.
We need something that is deeper, something with a moral promise that would include those who are excluded. So three values: one, human dignity; two, the common good; and third, stewardship. So that means finally the dignity of the woman who in Khayelitsha gets up at 4 a.m. to start her transportation to Cape Town, maybe the waterfront, where she can get to her employer's, boss's, master's house to give him tea in bed at 7 a.m. What's the human dignity between the two of them? That's critical. The common good. I love Ubuntu, the African idea. We are human only in relationship to each other. And stewardship. If our metric for success is quarterly shareholder profit and losses, we're in serious trouble. Indigenous people say you evaluate decisions today based on their impact in the 7th generation out. So short-termism really destroys an economy and politics.
Short-termism is the antithesis of the New Social Covenant. The values and the practical structures which make up the covenant system are dependent on long-term and sustained commitment. And while the idea is sound on paper, applying this to everyday business dealing will be a challenge.
I can see why skepticism would exist. The World Economic Forum, it consists of arguably the most powerful people in the world, and yet a lot of people suspiciously will argue that they have no interest in changing the order. In fact, I think the evidence over the last few years, especially at the Davos meetings, has been that they see the problem and they want to do something about it.
I think they are, and what I would add there is that they have to make the party much bigger. They have to go below the radar. Unless they do, all their good intentions are going to remain confined within a certain sector.
Well, of course, the old idea is that to be a successful leader, especially in business, you have to be a competitor and you have to beat the competition. But in fact, in the world that we're now confronting, cooperation is the byword for leadership. If you look beyond human kind to the animal world, you find a kind of cooperation every now and then that sustains genetic development over time. So I like to think of these as pelicans' gambits. It turns out that male pelicans are very competitive, but at key moments they'll share nesting material for their mates in order to provide the future. And it's extremely important for leaders in business right now to inside industries, inside particular geographic regions, South Africa and so on, to create cooperative entities that solve some of these long-term issues.
South African-based Pretoria Portland Cement, or PPC, is one organization which is changing social structures in line with the values of the New Social Covenant. Chief Executive Ketso Gordhan took a pay cut of 1 million rand last year and froze increases for the 60 top executives in the company. As a result, wage gap ratios closed from 120 to 1 to 40 to 1.
I think it's done two things. One is that workers now feel that they are being listened to. You know, they were very sweet. They said, thank you for the money. But what was much more important about what you did was that we talked, you listened, you did something about it. Secondly, I think people are beginning to feel like owners of the business. People are putting in weekend shifts and doing overtime and just feel a lot more part of the business than they used to. So we've already seen some, initial benefits, and hopefully we can grow that culture within the organization. I think it's a good idea, because one of the things you get out of that interaction is you get a better understanding of why people are unhappy. And then you realize that it's not that difficult to fix some of those problems. And sometimes people are very happy to hear the answer is no, I can't do that for you, but have a full explanation.
Former South African Finance Minister and Minister in the Presidency, Trevor Manuel, was selected as a global leader for tomorrow by the World Economic Forum in 1994 and continues to shape socio-economic agendas affecting our world. We hear from him after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to this special report on the World Economic Forum's meeting around the New Social Covenant, hosted by Stellenbosch University in August. CNBC Africa's Bronwyn Nielsen spoke to the former South African Finance Minister and Minister in the Presidency, Trevor Manuel, and got his views on the covenant and the steps South Africa needs to take in order to meet its goals. Let's take a look.
Trevor, thanks very much for your time. Now, I had the pleasure of interviewing Reverend Jim Wallace a little earlier today. And after the interview, he said to me, you must ask the tough questions. You must be a good journalist. So the reason you're going to get the tough questions is because of Reverend Wallace. So let me start by asking you whether you think a new social covenant is a dream, an intangible, or is it something that is really going to take effect in the world?
Well, let me share with you some of the observations I made in the sort of closed session, because I don't mind being on the record. Covenants work because you have different views participating in the establishment. And one of the problems about this discussion is that it's all too agreeable and nice. The process of covenants is always a very messy process. It's untidy, there are different voices, but you need to be clear about where you must take things. Now, starting with the premise that the world is a bad place, or in a bad place, that trust is broken, that there's great inequality is correct. But part of knowing that is also being informed about how we got to be here. If you don't understand that, then you risk repeating the same mistakes. And if you want to build trust, then it's very important that those issues be on the table as well, because you can't gloss over them.
When you say it's important that we understand how we got here, do you mean we've got to go to the root cause of the problem?
Yeah, I think that the problem has very distinct root causes. In fact, there's a kind of argument that says by the end of the Second World War, the previous history had been wiped out, new institutions were started, there were new opportunities, and then there was some phasing out of colonial relations and so on, and the world was in a much better place. But by the mid-80s, things started to unhinge very badly, because it was a different ideology taking root. And now you've had this multiplied over and over again, and leadership is in very short supply, and leadership is expected to deliver anything within a fixed time period, whether this be elected public leaders who are required to deliver by the time of the next election, or this be corporate leaders who are frequently required to deliver by the next quarter, because that's what analysts want. But we're talking of a problem that is deep.
Are we in crisis from a leadership perspective?
I think that we're in a crisis from a leadership perspective, but there's too little support, so it's easier to cop out. It's easier not to engage with the really difficult issues. And the really difficult issues are there in the intent of this covenant, which includes the fact that too many people are excluded from the mainstream at the moment. And the exclusion includes a sense of and reality of deep inequality in income distribution, but it's also there in opportunities.
Can I throw in a stat there? Because I think we've got to talk about this wealth gap, the income inequality, and hopefully I'm correct on this, but the richest 400 people in the US, their total wealth is the same as 155 million people, the poorest people in the US. So their combined wealth match one another. Now, doesn't that just put the size of the problem on the table? And how are we going to start to reverse that?
Yeah, I think that the point, and not many people have actually read Thomas Piketty through, but he makes a very strong point about the fact that you're not going to resolve it by taking X amount of the wealth of those wealthiest people and then just giving it to poorer people. We need to invest differently in public services and recreate opportunities. Now, it takes a little bit longer, but I think it's going to be a more durable change. And that's a big issue the world over. I see it in South Africa, I see it on the African continent, that there's resistance to the equalization of public services. If anything, public services for poor people ought to be better and stronger than those that more affluent people have access to.
How do we buy ourselves the time? You say the process is going to take longer. Isn't there, this is a ticking time bomb, isn't it?
You know, part of the discussion here is a tribute to somebody who should have been with us today, the late rector of University of Stellenbosch, Professor Russell Botman. And Russell was very strong on the idea of, and he quoted often from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of Hope. And the Pedagogy of Hope is quite a simple premise. It says that you've got to show that tomorrow is better than today, because today is demonstrably better than yesterday. And so if more people feel that they are being considered and that their lives are being included and that their lives will improve, then I think you have created that basis. But it won't work unless there's trust. And part of creating trust is actually creating that all-in sense that what exists at the moment is actually wrong and unfair, and the system is broken.
I like to source tangible examples, and I'm going to use PPC and Ketso Gordon as a tangible example of someone who has really put his money where his mouth is, and he's closed that wage gap within PPC from 120 to 1 to 40 to 1 by adjusting his top executives' pay and his lower workers or employees in terms of their pay levels and pulling those up slightly. I was chatting to Ketso earlier today, and he was saying, well, why can't business get together under business leadership in South Africa? And we get everybody to take 200,000 Rand, and we're talking about the CEOs now, from their salaries, from their annual salaries, pool that and start working from that pool in terms of upskilling, different education funds. Isn't that a starting point? Because he says the morale at PPC has changed dramatically. He's not losing his top executives.
It is a starting point. I think that you might need a basis that's fairer than 200,000.
We actually just pulled the number out of the sky now.
No, Ketso's used the number.
He cut R1 million off his own salary.
I'm aware of that, and he's talking about this fund, it's a worthy attempt. It's symbolic more than substantive. By Ketso's estimates, that'll produce R1 billion a year if it's done repeatedly. One thing that we must ensure is that the R1 billion is well spent. But R1 billion a year is about 1/3 of 1% of the size of our state budget. Now, there's very little merit in doing that if we as South Africans sit back and allow for the kinds of wastage we see of public resources. It's not one or the other. It's not about doing stuff to make us feel good as individuals and allowing for bad things to happen all around us. It's ensuring that we use the fruits of our democracy to raise the living standards of people in a demonstrable way. And yes, along the route, I think that if we use the Ketso Gordon example as a kind of benchmark, it's a good inspiration for other people.
Have you got better solutions as a starting
No, I don't have a
point?
better solution. I do think that in the way in which we crafted the National Development Plan, the working mechanism for this must firstly be active citizenry. And active citizenry, I think, would be expressed in the desire to have better outcomes in terms of what happens to public services. I think that's a very important starting point. I think we as the Planning Commission understood very clearly that sometimes that's going to be an untidy expression. It's not always going to be people sitting in neat rows raising procedural points in meetings. Sometimes it's a very loud voice. But active citizenry, I think, is a very important part of democracy. That's one part of it. The second part of it is, and it must assist and facilitate that active leadership, but it's also a consequence of it, and that is leadership in society. Leadership is not about one person. It's not about the executive of the ANC. It's not about the cabinet. It's about far more than that, and we need more people involved who see themselves as leaders, and that's quite important within this. And what you're saying to me about the example of a Ketso Gordon is the example of leadership. A third part of it is effective government. We'll know when it's there, just as we know when it's not there.
What is going to happen to the National Development Plan now?
Look, I can't rule this thing from the grave. Cyril Ramaphosa, as Deputy President and formerly Deputy Chair of the Planning Commission, is the Chair of the Planning Commission now. And we must encourage the continuing work, not just in private, because I do know that the Planning Commission is meeting periodically. It has to be seen to be focusing on implementation. And the combination now of the Secretariat of the Planning Commission with the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation is fundamentally important as well, because you can set where you want to get to and be held publicly accountable for performance against that.
Do you believe that we are going to see execution when it comes to the NDP?
You know, it's not about belief. It's about ensuring that we can raise the commitment levels. Some of these things actually take time because they're behavioral. And let me cite the example of education, where about 14 months ago there was the launch of the Education Collaboration Partnership Trust, which is jointly chaired by Angie Motsecha as Minister of Basic Education and Sizwe Nqasana as representing a voice from the private sector. And there's been, as far as I can see, a lot of work done in some of the more difficult education districts where problems appeared intractable. Part of what you need to change is not big curriculum. It can be facilitated by the issues people frequently talk about. Are we getting books in? Are we getting infrastructure improved upon? But the big challenge in education is whether you can change a number of relationships. Can you change the relationship of the teacher with the learners? And it requires of teachers to know their subject and be able to facilitate this. It is a moving target because many students have better access to information technology, and that's important. That's one relationship. The second is, can you change the relationship of the school principal to the teachers? Can the principal oversee what happens? And the third is, can you change the relationship between that principal and the community so that you've got better accountability for what happens in education?
Am I reading you correctly when I pick up a sense of hope? There's hope that the NDP will be executed.
Yeah, I think that if you take the last year and last Friday, I know that the Education Collaborative Partnership reported to the President. You've got to develop the metric. What happened in the first year? How can you accelerate that in the second year? How can you change that? Where do you want the measurement to improve? Not at St. Stithians High School or Rodin. You need it actually in some of the poorer communities. You need to go to Ngobo, you need to go to Duchwa, you need to go to really poor communities and ask whether the improvements are actually being made. But you also need to understand just how important this is in the context of the urban environment where the majority of South Africans now live.
If you woke up tomorrow and you were president of South Africa and you could make one decision that would impact the whole of South Africa, what would that be?
It would have to be in education. It would have to be to hold teachers accountable for what they do and for the salaries they earn.
So now you have a sense of some of the discussions that have taken place here over the last 3 days at Stellenbosch University around a new social covenant. The next step is Abu Dhabi in November 2014.